it increases anti-Semitism. It increases the horrible things that people were saying about Jewish money and Jewish financial connections. So instead of fighting the horrific and unfounded allegations about Judaism and finance and money, they are, fueling the anti-Semitic idea because of the way that they are refusing to acknowledge the fact that nowadays, in order to support Israel, you have to probably bribe people. Whereas in the past, you probably could have convinced them morally that what they're doing is right.
Things are so bad now.
They're so bad, you need money, influence, intimidation, whatever.
I've been working in the media now for more than 10 years. And there are some things that if you mention them, people start to get a little bit hot under the collar. One of them is the existence of an Israel lobby, a Zionist lobby. If you say those words, some people immediately accuse you of anti-Semitism. I know, because it's happened to me. But there is, without doubt, beyond any dispute whatsoever, an Israel lobby. It's real. And what's more, it's very old. And it certainly exists on both sides of the Atlantic. Author Ilan Pappé is, without doubt, one of the best historians on Israel-Palestine out there. And in his new book, he looks at the lobby in both the UK and the US over the last century and a half. It's an extraordinary book, and I think some of the details will shock you. Ilan Pappé, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you on. I've been a huge fan of your work for a very long time.
Thank you.
Hugely impressive, influential historian. Today we're talking about your new book, Lobbying for Zionism. I just spoke a moment ago before the camera started rolling how there are coffee stains on it.
That's fine. It's a good sign. It's a good sign. The book has been, at least the cover was read.
Yeah, exactly. And I enjoyed it immensely. I mean, it's more than 500 pages.
Yeah, I do apologize for that.
But it's very readable.
Yeah. But there was no other way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's what we could have done a series, frankly, on the content in here. Lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic. So we're talking about, obviously, the Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby prior to the formation of Israel, but in two countries over more than 100 years.
That's right.
So it's almost a miracle. It's this short in a way.
Exactly. It's a concise version, probably.
What made you want to write this book, and why now?
Yeah. Well, there was a conundrum that really bothered me for many years, but only recently has become more important to me than I think with everything else I was busy with, writing the history of Palestine and Israel. And there was the fact that I realized that Israel is probably the only country that still advocates for its legitimacy. And so that was one side of the coin. Why does a country, a state that is supposed to be a high-tech state with the strongest army in the Middle East, part of the Western world, part of the OECD, this very prestigious club of very developed economies, why is it still arguing itself, not people against it, but it itself arguing that people should give it legitimacy? That was one side of the coin. The other side of the coin was trying to understand after 100 years why the Palestinian cause, that for so many of us is simple and just and understandable, is still denied by so many people, especially people with power. And especially in places where governments and administrations have been involved for so many years with the question, and yet they seem to still deny the Palestinians, even 100 years later on. So it was these kind of two things. How do you denialism, if we can call it, how kind of a state of denial can really last in the 20th century and 21st centuries, which are not centuries which are easy to deny compared to, earlier time in history. And yet, with this great success of Zionism in Israel to deny the Palestinians, they feel unsafe. And they want to convince you and me, and especially whoever is in power, that they are legitimate. So that's a conundrum. And I thought that the best way to do this was to go back to the origin and slowly build up the story until today so that I can have a fuller picture.
Yeah, and it is remarkable, particularly in those earlier chapters, about lobbying for Zionism and not Israel prior to the formation of the State of Israel, particularly the stuff in Britain, I found really fascinating. Before we go on, obviously you're an academic on this subject. Mm-hmm. You were born in Israel.
Yes,
you were born in Haifa.
Yes, I was. Yes.
And you talk about, obviously, for the lobby, very controversial things. Have you yourself as an academic faced censure, attempted cancellations, people trying to remove a platform from you simply for chronicling these things as a historian?
Oh, yes. It started probably at the beginning of this century when I began to write more critically about Zionism and Israel. First of all, I was still teaching at the beginning of the century in Haifa, at Haifa University. And my writing led to strong pressure from the university on me to censor myself. And since I refused, I eventually was expelled from the University of Haifa in 2007. And I'm also barred from entering Israeli high schools and talk about these issues. I'm still an Israeli citizen, so I can go to Israel as a state. I'm not denied entry to the country, but I'm denied working as academic in the country.
So on what grounds? What's the basis? That national security or?
No, they were very clear. There was an indictment that was 10 pages long against me, and it had all kinds of clauses. One of them was that I'm defaming the state, which is not something you usually allege against academics, but in Israel you can. Disloyalty, lack of patriotism, lesser collegiality to my colleagues because I was supporting academic boycott on Israel. And all in all, supporting research on 1948 as an ethnic cleansing, which the academia and the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Education said it's tantamount to treason. So the allegation was very openly that my views disqualify me from being a member of the Israeli academia, which is quite surprising for an academia that thinks it's part of the Western world and part of a system which is supposed to, honor freedom of expression. And
scientific inquiry and whatnot.
Scientific inquiry. And since then, since I moved to England, I must say the University of Exeter has treated me very well since I arrived there about 17 years ago. So I don't feel at all censored in Exeter. But every now and then, I go to places and I'm invited and disinvited, especially in places like Germany, Italy, and France. Recently in the United States, I was stopped in the airport. I mean, these things do happen, but all in all, I have so many invitations, so the vast majority of the time I'm able to share my views with audiences, definitely in writing, but not only in writing. As you may know, and maybe that's the last point we can mention in this respect, that in my book in France, or one of my books in French, its distribution was stopped and its publication was stopped because a new owner bought one of the most prestigious French publishing houses called Fayard. And Fayard used to publish my book, The Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine, in French. Sorry.
Amazing book, by the way.
Yeah.
Hugely important.
And a billionaire, a pro-Zionist billionaire, bought the Fayard publishing house. And the first thing he did was to decide not to publish anymore the book under the Fayard trademark. So we found another publisher. It was not a big deal, but it's an interesting way of censoring.
And do you have a constitutional right as an Israeli citizen to free speech? So the things that you were talking about, are they meant to be enshrined in law?
Yes, but Israel has kind of ambiguous legal system. On the one hand, it's a very liberal system that definitely upholds the right of freedom of expression. On the other end, it's all conditioned by the security services approval or the army approval, or any of the security apparatuses that run the national security. So you can be, your freedom of expression can be safeguarded, but if someone in the Secret Service and so on says it is undermining Israel's international standing, it helps the enemies and so on, your right is immediately rescinded. So, it's a very conditional set of rights. And one should say we have 20% of the Israelis are Palestinian citizens. They have never had a proper defense from anyone on their right of self-expression, especially after the 7th of October. They really are being arrested left and right and suspended as students and lecturers because of just, human solidarity with the suffering of Gaza is enough to get you out of your job or into prison. And but even before that, there were. Let's put it this way. Maybe that will illustrate what I'm saying. If a Palestinian historian, Israeli citizen, would have said what I would have said, he or she would probably be treated far worse than I was treated. But I'm totally convinced about it. So, not to mention, of course, millions of Palestinians in the West Bank that have no basic rights of any kind. So yes, this is, whatever is written in letter is not that important. What matters is in practice, and in practice, people's right for of people's freedom of expression in Israel is very conditioned and limited and censored.
I hope you're enjoying this interview, and I hope you agree that it's a really vital conversation. That's the thing with Novara Media. We get to have the conversations, and we get to platform individuals and books to a very large audience, which simply isn't happening elsewhere. We're having the conversations that legacy media doesn't want to have, can't have, or simply doesn't like. If you think we need a people-powered media, if we need a new media for different politics, and that we're doing good work here at Novara Media, then why not support what we do? The link is in the description below. That's novaramedia.com/support. It can be as little as you want a month. We all have our direct debits going out every month. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, Childline, the Labour Party, the Green Party, I don't know. I have a few, including the National Trust. But if you think changing the media is a precursor necessarily to changing politics in the UK, I think it's really important to support our work here at Novara Media. We are halfway through a general election campaign, and I think we're covering this campaign, the policies, the politics, the politicians, like nobody else. If you agree, like I say, you can support our work. That link is in the description below. That's hugely interesting because obviously nobody thinks that people in Gaza are free, or the West Bank are free, or Israeli Arabs are free. But the fact that even those constraints exist on Jewish Israelis is quite extraordinary. Yeah. We could do a whole other conversation about that book you mentioned a moment ago, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which was just a huge eye-opener for me. And I recommend that very much to people watching or listening. If you come back in the future, we can discuss it.
I hope so.
But today we're talking about the Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby. How did Zionism as a political orthodoxy begin?
It began, and that many people are surprised when they hear it, it began as a Christian idea, not a Jewish idea. It was part of the dogma of the emerging evangelical Christianity as a result of the division between Catholics and Protestants, and later on all kind of theological streams developed out of Protestant Christianity. One of them was very strong, was the evangelical Christianity. And a special group of people there called the Restorationists, probably somewhere in the 17th century, definitely towards the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. We're talking about individuals, and that's why it's not that easy to locate it chronologically. But let's say quite a few years before Zionism appeared as a Jewish idea, for them Zionism was a religious imperative to try and convince the Jews, especially in Britain and the United States, to go to Palestine. as part of a divine scheme that, in their eyes, would ignite a process that would bring us closer to the end of times. So first the Jews return to Palestine, then the Messiah is coming back, then there's the resurrection of the dead, the Jews are converted to Christianity, and in various versions, 1,000 years of Christ begin. I mean, with various degrees of conviction, people felt about the next stages, but they were all united about the first stage, that the Jews, as they would call it, had to return to Palestine. Now, these people at first were just theologians, scholars, so that didn't mean much. But very early on, they succeeded in persuading laymen who were important politicians that this was a worthy project, not just because it might or might not bring back Christ, but because it opened the way for a strategic thinking of ceding from the Ottoman Empire that was controlling Palestine since the 16th century, and bring back the Holy Land, as they would call it, but also the areas around it, back to the rule of the Western world and Christianity. So you had these, at the beginning, this alliance between pious evangelical Christians and more imperialist thinking laymen, I could say, politicians. I think in America it was more religious because America didn't have at that time any imperial ambitions about the Middle East. But for Britain, it was much more than the religion. For British, it was rethinking an old imperial idea. The old imperial idea in Britain that held on, I suppose, until the beginning of the 19th century was that you don't disintegrate the Ottoman Empire. Because if you disintegrate the Ottoman Empire, there will be a fight for the spoils, and everybody would fight everyone, which is how the First World War actually unfolded eventually. And so they were trying to keep it, they used to call it the sick man on the Bosphorus. They knew that the empire was declining, but they would try to hold it together to prevent this, scramble for provinces that used to be ruled by the Ottomans. However, when it came to Palestine, a strong lobby began to emerge saying that Palestine should be part of the Western world. Now, the moment their ideas began to impress Jewish intellectuals in the Central and Eastern Europe, there began to be an alliance between evangelical Christians, imperialists, British policymakers, and leading Jewish intellectuals. And they had their own reasons to want to cause the return of the Jews, as they would call it as well. For them, it was an answer for antisemitism. It was the best way to modernize the Jewish people, and it was a despair from the fact that Europe probably would never properly integrate the Jews. So everybody had his own discrete interest, but it was a powerful alliance already in the mid-19th century, definitely towards the end of the 19th century. And this is why, that's how Zionism became. And it's interesting, and with this I would end, that the Jewish people, or the Jewish leaders that led Zionism, were made of Western European Jews who did not at all think that their place is in Palestine. Part of them were British aristocrats, Anglo-Jewish aristocrats. They actually shared sentiments like the ones expressed by Lord Balfour in 1905 when he was the Prime Minister of Britain, that indeed there is anti-Semitism in Central and Eastern Europe that has to be resolved. But God forbid if the result would be an influx of Eastern European Jews into Britain. They wanted to stop it. Both the Anglo-Jewish aristocrats and Balfour wanted to stop the influx of poor Jews coming. And they also, after 1905, began to think they're all Bolsheviks as well, and so on. So it was trying to make sure into which direction the flight from Russia and Poland and Romania is going. And that would be. So I think that's a formative period of Zionism, where Christianity, imperialism, and fresh ideas of Jewish nationalism create together this project that says, let's colonize Palestine and create not just a British state there, but also a Jewish British state.
I find this idea as well of Anglo Jewry, people with political influence, some of them serving in, senior government positions,
Absolutely.
in the First World War and whatnot. There were politicians, by the way, who were also anti-Zionist.
That's right.
But I find it extraordinary that there's almost this version of what we would today call pulling up the ladder.
Yeah.
And they say, look, well, we've arrived. We don't want the rest of them to come, okay? And that's obviously a leitmotif you see throughout history. You might say somebody like Suella Braverman in the 2020s
Absolutely.
is the same. And it's interesting to see that same thing recur previously. Quickly, before we talk about Theodor Herzl and this idea of Zionism, as I think most people would understand it as a form of 19th century European-style nationalism.
That's right.
Who's the Earl of Shaftesbury? Because I think most people know about Shaftesbury in terms of, if they know of him at all, child labour laws, etc.
Exactly.
But what's his relationship to Zionism?
Yeah. Shaftesbury, apart from being a philanthropist and definitely someone who took the cause of the poor people, especially in the London area, very seriously, was also a very devout evangelical Christian. And he saw the very dramatic development that were happening in Palestine in the years 1830 to 1840. These were 10 years when an Egyptian ruler, Muhammad Ali, occupied Palestine, ceded Palestine from the Ottoman Empire. And everybody in Europe thought that he wouldn't stop there, that he might be able to go as far as Istanbul and depose the Sultan. He saw it as a devout evangelical Christian. He said, oh, this is a sign of the end of time, millennialism, right? This is about to happen. And Britain as an empire should take advantage of that. And he had family connection with Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, and he began to push seriously for deep British involvement, first of all in Palestine, and then for pushing the British to occupy Palestine, which he did not succeed at the time in the 1840s. What he did succeed, which is very important, is to convince the British government to have a consul in Jerusalem. And that consul, James Finn, was very much involved in encouraging Jewish settlers and immigrants to come to Palestine. He was Islamophobic, he was quite racist towards the local Palestinian. And therefore, Shaftesbury kind of laid the foundation for the idea that if strategically the British Empire thinks that Palestine is important, it's best served by being a Jewish Palestine. Because there were voices in Britain who would say, all right, we might have the allegiance of Egyptians or people in Damascus or Beirut and Palestine. These are all Arabs. Later on, as you know, Lawrence of Arabia would say the best allies Britain could have are Arabs, not Jews. And in order to contradict this kind of idea that Britain actually, which Britain usually did as a colonialist empire, it looked for the local elites and collaborative elites.
Yeah.
And that's how it ran the empire.
Yeah.
So it made sense for Britain to go to the local Palestinian elite. And they would, by the way, have go along with this and say, rule for us, Palestine. And Palestine said, no, this has to be an exceptional case where we are both solving the Jewish problem of Europe and we are getting the Holy Land in a much better position, both as Christians and as British.
It's funny you say this about local elites and the approach of the British Empire, because my wife is Maltese, both her parents are Maltese. And of course, Maltese is the only Semitic language in the European Union. It's very similar to Arabic. Arabic basically with the European alphabet, as far as I can tell, and a dash of Italian. And I only found this out recently, but the British actually effectively campaigned to conserve the Maltese language as a bulwark against Italian influence.
Right.
And you think, crikey, these people are so clever. That's how you do it. So people think, wow, isn't it amazing that, there's still this language. It's managed to hold on. It's held on because of British
imperial interest. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
fascinating.
definitely.
And this is the exception. Theodor Herzl.
Yeah.
Who was he? Why is he so important in terms of Zionism?
Theodor Herzl was a Viennese Jew who actually wanted, in the early beginning of his life, to be accepted into these prestigious clubs that German romantic nationalists had. He really loved the idea of romantic nationalism, especially the Germanic one. And he was a playwright and a journalist, and he was not accepted because they didn't accept Jews. And that pushed him into thinking that if he cannot advocate German romantic nationalism, he can advocate Jewish romantic nationalism. And he became very much infatuated with this idea that the Jews could emulate the German romantic nationalist idea, but obviously not in Europe. So it had to be somewhere else. He was never totally hooked on Palestine because he would suggest later on in his career that anywhere the British could help a Jewish national homeland to be built is fine. And when the British were seriously thinking about Uganda, he was not against it, although most Zionist leaders were. He's important because he's the first one who took the early steps to build the organization, the World Zionist Organization, to convene its first conference in Basel in 1897. He was also important because he understood that unlike the most of his colleagues in the early Zionist leadership, it would not be enough to colonize Palestine, namely to go over, buy land and build Jewish colonies. You will need an international umbrella to support this project. He did not succeed that much in creating the international umbrella. He died in 1904, so he didn't see that actually his efforts were successful in the Balfour Declaration, but he was not responsible for this. But he is considered, I think rightly so, the founding father or the early prophet of Zionism. What I found fascinating is what I found about the Anglo-Zionist aristocracies, which we talked about before. In every conversation he had with a leader or ruler in Europe, he kept explaining that this is not for the Western European Jews, it's all for the Eastern European Jews, and it will prevent them from entering Western Europe and Britain and so on. So it was quite an incredible beginning of Zionism. He, I think, planted this idea that if Europe doesn't want you, you can recreate Europe somewhere else. He knew that there was a problem there because there were other people there. But he said, for the sake of creating a new Europe, you can get rid of the other people. Which was very important for the next generation of Zionist leaders to accept as a moral imperative.
And as somebody who's British, I like to think of myself as English, but British, the chapters you talk about with regards to Herzl's trips to the UK, his influence in the UK, and how he's received by British Jews in the late 19th century is fascinating. So you effectively have domestic Anglo Jewry, Jewish aristocracy, not really having much time for the man.
No.
But he's very well received by the working class Jews of the East End.
Absolutely.
Who were otherwise tempted by socialism, anarchism. But there's this political constituency which really can go one way or another.
Exactly.
Zionism and occupation of Palestine or socialism. And meanwhile, at the sort of upper echelons of Anglo Jewry, that's very much not the case. And I didn't know this. I mean, I really had no idea about this. But obviously today you have the Jewish Chronicle, which is a pro-Zionist newspaper. But there were anti-Zionist Jewish newspapers with very large readerships.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There were several of them. And they came from two different angles. One was a more liberal, conservative Jewish fear of Bolshevism, thinking that Zionism, because Zionism was very much connected to socialism in its early stages, that they're bringing, kind of revolutionary ideas into Britain and will complicate life for Jews that would be equated with revolutionary ideas. So there was one angle where sometimes members of aristocratic families that supported Zionism were confronted by other members of the same family who were very much against Zionism. And then was the more, I would call the more devout socialist and communist who understood that socialism and even Marxism later on cannot be implemented through colonialism. and that their role is really to create in Britain a just society, not somewhere else. And they believe that anti-Semitism would be uprooted in a more egalitarian, socialist, or even Marxist society with other forms of racism. So yes, the Jewish Chronicle was actually the exception that proved the rule, because a lot of Jews were still very religious as well. And for the religious Jews, this was tempering with God's will, this whole idea of building a nation state in Palestine. It was a minority view. It was definitely a minority view until the Holocaust.
You talk about it as aristocratic feuds about Zionism in the book. And again, that's fascinating for me. Some of the portraits of the individuals you really go over are really gripping. There's one called Edwin Samuel Montagu, very senior politician in this country.
Absolutely.
And he was an anti-Zionist. That's what we would call him today anyway.
Yeah.
And there are some things he says here which are just extraordinary. So I'm going to read this really. He refers to Zionism as a mischievous political creed. If a politician did this today, they'd be over.
It would be the end, yes.
This gentleman was a British Jew operating at the very highest levels of politics. And he wrote a memorandum saying, the Turks and other Mahmadiyans or Muslims in Palestine will be regarded as foreigners, just in the same way as Jews will hereafter be treated as foreigners in every country but Palestine. He goes on to say, the sympathy which the president of the local government board suggests is widespread and deep-rooted in the Protestant world, with the idea of restoring the Hebrew people to the land which was to be their inheritance, is, I fear, very often a thinly cloaked desire to get rid of the Jewish ingredient in Protestant populations. And then finally, and this is extraordinary, I assert that there is no Jewish nation. The members of my family, for instance, who have been in this country for generations, have no sort or kind of community of view or of desire with any Jewish family in any other country beyond the fact that they profess to a greater or less degree the same religion. It is no more true to say that a Christian Englishman and a Christian Frenchman are of the same nation. Wow. And this is 100 years ago.
100 years ago, yeah.
Utterly extraordinary.
Extraordinary, so relevant. When I wrote this particular pages, it was before the 7th of October. And since the 7th of October, a lot of young Jews, especially in the United States, began to dissociate themselves more clearly from Zionism and sort of redefine their Judaism. And it's like a closing of a circle. They go back to his basic idea that for them, Judaism is a religion and not a nation, not nationalism. So yes, he was very prophetic. Zionism turned the Palestinians into aliens in their own lands. And in many places, when Zionism claimed the Jews are not the nation of the home country, but they are a different nation, they alienate them. They turn them into aliens, In some places, it was very disastrous, like in North Africa. When Zionism convinced enough Jews in Morocco that they are aliens, although they lived there longer than most of Moroccans, But they told them, no, you're not Moroccans. You are a different nation. Not surprisingly, the whole attitude towards them in Morocco changed. So what are you? You're self-declaring yourself to be a different nation. And this is at the time when Morocco fights for decolonization and self-determination, right? Zionism was awful. Obviously, it victimized the Palestinians more than anyone else. But it was bad news for the Jews. It was really, there's some places where the Zionist idea have ruined the life of Jewish communities. Iraq, especially in the Arab world, and North Africa, but not only. So it was an ideology that really intoxicated the relationship between the Jews and the rest of the community around them.
As somebody who's not British by blood, and this is a different conversation. I have very, I hope, considered criticisms of Zionism precisely because if you're a British Jew and you're saying your homeland is Israel, well, what does that mean for me as somebody whose, ancestors aren't from here? And to go back finally to Mr. Montagu, he writes, if Palestine will be the national home of the Jews, all the voters in my constituency will tell me, go home.
Absolutely.
Really extraordinary. And then this final detail, this is according to Mr. Weizmann writing about this. After the Balfour Declaration, He says there was nothing new in what he had to say, but the vehemence with which he urged his views, the implacability of his opposition, astonished the cabinet. I understand the man almost wept.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. I mean, this should be a Netflix series.
Yeah, exactly.
Really extraordinary. But it's a history we've just completely lost in this country.
Totally. I don't think most people have been aware of this, because the power of the Zionist narrative is that it has a simple version that so many people, were educated on. And it was never done with high resolution. So people did not look at the innuendos and the details. So that's why a lot of important details that I think explain much better what Zionism is are being lost in this kind of very simplistic reductionist version that most people have on Zionism. And the only way of unpacking it is really by having a detailed history of this, because otherwise you can't do it with sound bites, that's for sure.
So to fast forward, maybe we'll go back to the Balfour Declaration in a moment. I mean, it's obviously an important moment in this story.
Absolutely.
But to talk about the Israel lobby in this country, obviously that's only the Israel lobby after the foundation of the State of Israel. Labour Friends of Israel, which I want to talk about at length, when are they founded? And who are the driving forces domestically behind the formation of Labour Friends of Israel?
Yeah, the Labour Friends of Israel are founded in the early 1950s by very important people on the left wing of the Labour Party, surprisingly. Ian Mikado is one of them, but also Aaron Bevan, the one who founded the NHS. It's interesting that they bought into two mythologies which were incorrect. One, that in Israel, socialism has really been implemented in the best way possible, given all the disappointments from the Soviet Union and other places. So they thought that they sort of looked at the kibbutz, in which 1% of the Israelis lived, as if this was Israel as a whole. So it was the socialist dream come true. So they felt they need to make sure that this is supported. Secondly, people don't probably remember this, but the Labour Party already in the Attlee government between 1945 to 51, before the Conservatives came back to power, was quite hawkish in the Cold War politics. Its discourse on the Soviet Union was not different from the conservative one. They didn't hesitate to support Franco as a bulwark and Salazar as a bulwark against communism. They supported all the reactionary rulers in the Arab and Asian worlds and African world just to maintain the empire, or not the empire itself, which they were willing to disintegrate, but the British influence there. So Israel was both, ironically, was both a socialist dream, but one that belongs to the Western world in the Cold War. And I think that was how they created it. They were not the initiators of this idea. The Zionist lobby before the creation of State of Israel already had long experience of how to deal with British politics. And very much like their counterparts in America, who in the very same time would found AIPAC, the famous pro-Israeli lobby in the United States, at the very same time had this idea that you need to understand the political system you work in, and you have to influence politicians from their very early days in the job or the early career stages. And they already knew this in the 1900s when they started trying to influence British members of parliament to support Zionism, long before Balfour Declaration. So the machinery was already there and very effective. And under the Zionist agencies that were still working, despite the creation of the State of Israel, Israel did not dismantle the Zionist organizations. The pre-state Zionist organization continued to operate. Now, of course, they were not advocating the creation of a Jewish state anymore, but they were advocating support for the Jewish state now. The Jewish National Fund, the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, all pre-state Israeli institutions that began were transformed into the pro-Israeli lobby. And they worked very closely with members of parliament. It's interesting that they themselves probably thought of Israel as more akin to a socialist democratic country. And that's why most of their connections were with the Labour Party, not with the Conservative Party. Even after the Conservatives came to power, they still thought Labour was their, it's difficult to think about it maybe, or maybe not today, I don't know. Think about Keith Starmer, again, a circle closed again, that Labour was a safe bet as someone who would be presenting the Israeli case both in the parliament and should they return to power also in the government. And of course the TUC were very important for them, the trade union council was very important for them as well.
And they had a very close relationship to the Israeli equivalent of the TUC.
Yeah, the Histadrut, which is very, very much so.
Which never seems to talk very much about workers' rights.
No, not at all. I mean, worker rights in the sense that Israeli Jewish worker rights were, they definitely advanced these rights.
Yeah.
But they totally ignored the rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And in Britain, they were not arguing for workers' rights. They were arguing for Israel and its policies.
The extension of foreign policy interests really through
Absolutely,
the Labour movement.
Absolutely. And I think later on some members of the TUC found out that this is what is going on. And I think the TUC, unlike the Labour Party, became a bit more critical of Israel than the party itself as the years went by.
See, I think a lot of this would shock people who are listening, who are watching. You talked about Samuel Montague, and now you're saying that chap was an anti-Zionist, but now there's sort of some of the great names of 20th century British socialism, Nye Bevan, Harold Wilson, social democrat, but much more left-wing than the people that came after him as a Labour prime minister. These were big supporters of the state of Israel. And I do find it interesting, like that world of the early 1960s, because I've read about how Harold Wilson referred to Lee Kuan Yew, the father of Singaporean, capitalism, as a social democrat.
Yeah.
And it just, for us in the 2020s, is so strange that, ostensibly British socialists were saying that Lee Kuan Yew and Israel were socialist states.
Yeah.
Very odd.
Very odd indeed, because Wilson, on the other hand, was a strong critic of the apartheid South Africa. And, everybody who worked with him remember that he said that he had red lines when it came to apartheid South Africa. He would not allow the party at all to show any sympathy to apartheid South Africa. And with the same commitment, he talked about Israel. He said, and I won't allow anyone to criticize Israel or to show lack of support. So he kind of equated the ANC, or it was not yet the ANC, whatever was the liberation movement in South Africa, with Zionism. And this is at the time when people in his own party, like Christopher Mayo, were there on the ground and telling him what they saw with their own eyes, how Palestinians are being treated before 1967, and Wilson, as we know, after 1967. And it somehow did not at all register with him that the Palestinians were victims as well of something that deserves British sympathy and so on. I mean, if I compare, for instance, which for me is very difficult because I hated Margaret Thatcher, but if I compare Margaret Thatcher's comments on the Palestinians with Harold Wilson comments on the Palestinians, you will give Margaret Thatcher the Nobel Peace Prize on this one, because it's like she talked compassionately about the Palestinian suffering. She was aware of what was going on. Don't misunderstand me. People would think that I'm a Thatcherite. I'm not at all. But she had this basic awareness of what's going on in Palestine. Wilson was there. It's not that he didn't see, but for example, he was honored with planting a forest on the ruins of about 3 or 4 Palestinian villages, the Britannia forest. And people were trying to approach him, said, this is not a recreational park. This is an erasure of massacres and ethnic cleansing. Nothing. Nothing moved him on this very, very interesting and intriguing.
And why was that? Because you've talked about the role of these lobbying organizations from the early 20th century, how they that's the word, they groomed politicians.
Absolutely.
Right from the start of their careers. Was it because of that, or was it because of the Holocaust and a sense of wider European collective guilt that hadn't been avoided?
It goes together. He was groomed from the very beginning by the pro-Israeli, by the labor friends of Israel, and they knew how to bestow honors and more than that, influence on him. But there must have been something ripe there. It's kind of ripe soil for this kind of influence. Namely, and he talks about it in his book, Chariots of Israel. He talks about the religious upbringing that he had, kind of a Sunday school thing about Palestine. So it kind of, again, this kind of evangelical, doesn't have to be evangelical, but the kind of Christianity that sees the Jews as the lost sons or children, that have to return and so on. So he also had that. It didn't mean that everyone who was like that immediately became so pro-Israeli as he did. For that, the pro-Israeli lobby probably had it right, that they probably understood that he was destined to be a powerful person. They usually did not invest much energy if they thought someone would not get very far in the party. AIPAC perfected this system much better but it's more because it's more difficult in the British system, because we have the constituency system here, so it's not that easy, right? You're not just a member of a party; you're also a member of a constituency. So that's a bit more difficult to strategize how to influence you. In America, it's easier because you're part of a party. But even here, they did quite a good job in creating enough influence on enough number of influential people. And one of them was Harold Wilson.
You mentioned a moment ago Conservative Friends of Israel. I think there are estimates out there today about 80% of Tory MPs are members of Conservative Friends of Israel. When did they start?
They started a bit later in the 60s, and they were very marginal compared to the Labour Friends of Israel. I think that for many, many years, they were not very influential because as long as the Labour Party in Israel was in power until 1977, there was maybe a reluctance to be in touch with the Conservative Friends of Israel. Margaret Thatcher was a member of the Conservative Friends of Israel, but even she was not very strongly connected. She used them for being elected in her Finchley constituency, but she had very little contact with them during her reign in power. So I would say that actually we suddenly are exposed to their power during David Cameron's. So it's really a very recent phenomenon that the Conservative Friends of Israel exerts so much influence, and we know we owe it to some very brave journalists who exposed that, Peter Odborn, and it's quite amazing because this whole infrastructure that was built by the Conservative Friends of Israel with a lot of money to make sure that liberal values that conservative parties may adhere to would not come in the way, because we're talking about the end of the 20th century. Almost everyone knew what was going on in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it's much more difficult to persuade people, to totally accept not only an Israeli point of view, but an Israeli right-wing point of view as something that should be endorsed by Britain.
So something you'll hear on the left in the UK is that obviously what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank is bad. Obviously there's a right-wing Israeli government, they're bad, but the British left should work with the Israeli left in order to underpin a two-state solution or whatever you think is the preferred political outcome. That's something you often hear. And it's something you hear from the pro-Israel left inside the Labour Party. Jewish Labour movement, we'll talk about them more in a moment, LFI. And they'll say, these are the avenues through which actually, if you want to help Palestinians, you should work with these guys and commit yourself to this politics. What you're saying, though, actually, since the 1950s, is these are the precise interests which have underpinned apartheid, the impossibility of Palestinian liberation.
Absolutely. It was, in many ways, as so many Palestinian friends of mine would say, they find it easier to deal with Israel that is ruled by a right-wing government. Because what you see, what you get is what, it's transparent. They talk openly about their views. It's not complicated. You can easily show their racism, their lack of willingness to compromise, and so on. And it's much more difficult with the Zionist left, because supposedly there are universal values here. But what is interesting about labor Zionism in Israel, and later on we would call it liberal Zionism, that there is no connection between the language that they use and the action that they perform on the ground. So there is a deception here that is very sophisticated and for many years worked very well, that you talk about, unlike the right wing in Israel, you talk about the wish for peace, for reconciliation, and yet you build more Jewish settlements in the West Bank than the right-wing governments. But you talk much nicer about the future. And it takes time. It takes time to cut through, this deception. And this was kind of provided the shield of immunity for Israel. As long as it seemed like liberal or left Zionist parties are at the realm. But it was really a kind of thing that mesmerized people and blinded them to what was going on the ground. And therefore, I think that's why this whole idea that there was a genuine peace camp in Israel that unfortunately was waiting in vain for the emergence of a similar equivalent peace camp on the Palestinian side. This was never true. What people call the peace camp in Israel was a willingness, a tactical willingness, to rule the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in a more indirect way.
So there is no real peace camp in Israeli politics?
There never was. There are small anti-Zionist individuals and groups, like Matzpen at the time, Compass. There are members of the Israeli Communist Party, I think, who genuinely believe in peace, which is reconciliation, which is admitting what Israel did in the past and now looking for rectification of injustices and building a future on the basis of equality. But what is called usually the peace camp in Israel is not thinking in equal terms. It thinks about ideas that would allow Israel to be more indirectly involved in the life of the Palestinians, very much like South Africans were thinking about the Bantustans at the time, that you can allow them autonomy, and that would mean that you're not occupying them directly. And it took some time for some Palestinians who believed in it to wake up and understand that actually this is worse. The best way of describing it is to talk to people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and they will tell you that life after the Oslo process in 1993 was far worse than life before. That is, life after the peace agreement between Israel and PLO became far worse for the vast majority of the Palestinians. Peace process usually should mean improvement in your life, the way you live. And in every aspect of life, life became much worse for Palestinians after the Oslo peace process. And this is a reflection of what the peace camp in Israel is, because the peace camp in Israel determined the conditions and terms of the Oslo Accord.
So going back to the Jewish labor movement for a moment, they were originally called Pole Zion, is that what you call it?
Pole Zion, yes, the workers of Zion, yeah.
And today, they still exist, Jewish labor movement. You have many Labour Party members, Labour Party MPs. And if you say that the Jewish labor movement is a pro-Israel organization as part of the Israel lobby, you'll be generally called an anti-Semite.
That's right.
Generally. Presumably, however, it is part of the pro-Israel lobby.
Absolutely. It is meant to talk to workers or unions on the need to include unconditional support for Israel as part of their socialist worldview. So they act as an embassy for Israel or ambassadors for Israel. That doesn't mean that they're not acting also for universal rights of laborers or workers in Britain. It's not mutually exclusive. But definitely the reason they were created was to colonize Palestine, then to support the colonization, and then to sustain the state of Israel. And that's still part of what they're doing. And to call it anti-Semitism is ridiculous because this is not born as part of hatred of Jews. This is usually mentioned because it's part of this powerful alliance that allows the suffering of the Palestinians to continue. And I think anyone who supports the justice for the Palestinians is an anti-racist person, not a racist person. But of course, we know that anti-Semitism is being weaponized in order to silence any criticism on Israel and its policies.
Do you sometimes feel like, I mean, this must be a silly question in a way because you've been in this academic field for decades, but do you sometimes feel like you're going crazy when somebody will say criticism of JLM, saying that JLM, you just called it an embassy of Israel, I think that's absolutely right, they're ambassadors for Israel. Criticism of JLM is anti-Semitic. Do you sometimes feel like, this is so obvious and straightforward. How can somebody say that with a straight face?
Well, I think because I'm an academic, I understand where these positions come from. So I'm not rattled by them. I'm used to them. And I try to unpack them and explain to people. I can understand how intimidating they can be, and they can paralyze people and stop them from making criticisms. But for me personally, I know, I expect them, I preempt them. I know that they're coming, and maybe at the beginning of my career as an academic, it could have rattled me, but not today, of course. Yeah.
So we've talked about the UK a hell of a lot, which inevitably will. We're in the UK.
Yeah, we are.
AIPAC, however, is obviously the far more influential, far better resource than any lobbying organization in this country. Who are AIPAC? When do they start? And what is the extent of their influence at the high point for them in American politics?
AIPAC began actually as a propaganda wing or department in an earlier pro-Zionist organization called AIPAC, the American Zionist Emergency Committee. It was an emergency committee because it was founded during the Holocaust. But it was working less for the rights of Jews in the Holocaust and much more for the rights of the Jews in the colonization of Palestine. And after the creation of the State of Israel, the PR department of AIPAC became AIPAC. It was initiative by the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations at the time, Abba Eban, and some members of that previous Zionist organization. So in the early 1950s, it was created. And it was very much, it already had the methodology from the earlier organizations. So they didn't invent the wheel. They actually continued a very effective work by the previous pro-Zionist organization. People think that AIPAC invented anything. It didn't. It really just perfected an already an American idea of how to lobby. That is targeting politicians from an early stage of their career, flooding the newspapers with letters at the time, buying time on radio, later on television, creating scholarship for students and academics to make sure that they will be pro-Zionists, making sure that in every walk of life they have a presence where there is even this modicum of potential that someone might influence the American policy towards Israel. And there were, because we're talking about the nation of 300 million today, but already then, it was a mega organization, undoubtedly. Still is.
And its apogee was really under Bush.
Yeah, apogee was under Bush.
Bush Jr., I should say.
Bush Jr., exactly. and because it made a strategic decision that its future relies on the conservative side of the Republican Party. In a way, the Obama years were not prophesized correctly by them. They didn't expect the Democrats to come to power, and yet, and I hope they're wrong, and they may be right, they thought that the exception of the rule of American politics are a democratic administration, that America's, at least near future, is a Republican, and not just a Republican, a far-right Republican. They might be wrong as well. I mean, we can see, if you look from 2000 until today, you cannot say that any of the party dominated the whole 24 years, right? But they understood that this is where power lies as far as Israel is concerned, and relied on the fact that the Democratic Party has this inertia, as we saw with Biden, in it, not to, deviate too much, even if AIPAC is less working effectively there than it does in the Republican Party. Yeah.
But what's quite extraordinary, you've said that there, is that actually, obviously, there's this huge pushback against Zionism now amongst younger progressive Jewish Americans and younger Americans and younger progressives. But there's also increasingly a strand of thought on the US radical right.
That's right.
Which is, we don't want to send money to Ukraine. We don't want to send money to Israel. It's kind of half-formed, but you can see where it's going to end up, which is America first. And okay, we like Netanyahu. We prefer the Israelis to the Palestinians, but frankly, we're not going to give you $14 billion. That seems almost like a glitch in the matrix when it comes to AIPAC. Yeah. How has that happened, and how are they responding to it?
Well, I think this is one of their failures, to understand that Israel can be either a moral asset or ideological asset in the eyes of people, or a material asset, strategic asset. And they always thought that if the one doesn't work, the other would work. Maybe with the Democrats it should be moral, maybe with the Republican, or the other way around, doesn't matter. And then I think they failed to see the developments in the area as a whole. Namely, the arm industry in America does not have to see Israel anymore as its preferred target. They can sell enough people in the Arabian Peninsula to buy, probably to pay even more for the weapons. And they failed to understand the connection between isolationist tendency that you're talking about and its possible impact on Israel. Probably what blinded them is this weird combination you have today in the Republican Party between Christian Zionists, who still are very powerful in the kind of Tea Party wing of the party, and as you rightly say, the isolationist extreme right wing, who would probably in the future would not want the American support for Israel to be on the same level that it is today. Yeah, they missed that, and I don't see how they can adapt themselves to this new reality. I'm sorry.
Talking about the impact of AIPAC on US foreign policy. Now, one might think it only really applies to Israel, but again, one of the really illuminating parts of this book is actually showing the role of AIPAC in lobbying for the war in Iraq. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that Israel pushed the war in Iraq. It's primarily pushed, obviously, by neoconservatives, people around George W. Bush. But there is clearly a very strong lobby, former Israeli leaders or serving Israeli politicians, newspapers, and AIPAC itself. They are promoting this idea of war with Iraq very heavily. Why? Because these are organizations, AIPAC is an organization that exists to promote the interests of Israel, but it's interfering in the politics of another country to invade a third country.
Yeah. I think it's a quid pro quo between, tit for tat if you want, between the neoconservative lobby of America, which is not pro-Israeli by essence, but is supporting very hawkish American policies in the Middle East, an Islamophobic kind of conservative think tank. And they understood that if they can describe their wish for deeper American involvement in the Middle East as a project that defends Israel, it will have more allies on Capitol Hill to support this aggressive policy. And that's why you have this kind of connection. So I think AIPAC by nature was not interested that much in American, assault on Iraq, but it owed it in a way to the neoconservatives. Now, many of these major thinkers on the extreme right, or the neo-right as we call them, neoconservatives, were both serving in pro-Israeli think tanks and neoconservative think tanks. Usually you can find them in both. So the two kind of programs went together. And Israel was never able, although it wanted, through AIPAC, to even play a more active role. If you remember, Bush Sr. did not allow Israel to be involved in the first war against Iraq. Bush Jr. did not allow them to be involved in the second war in Iraq. They wanted very much to be involved. So it was the neoconservatives didn't want the Israeli army there. They wanted AIPAC there. It was more important to them to have AIPAC than Israel as supporting aggressive American policies in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2003 and later on.
It's quite, I mean, again, you've said you're an academic, so you have a sort of dispassionate approach with this stuff. But if you say that actually the Israel lobby promoted war in Iraq, again, people say, that's anti-Semitic, how dare you say that? But it's there in black and white. And again, that's the power of being a historian. For instance, you talk about Benjamin Netanyahu. He wrote about this in op-eds for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, where he wrote the case for toppling Saddam and stated nothing less than dismantling his regime will do. He says the same about, obviously, Hamas today in Gaza. And then he even spoke to the American Senate in 2002, saying the urgent need to topple Saddam is paramount. You've then got Israel's foreign minister, Shimon Peres. Saddam Hussein is as dangerous as bin Laden. And then last but not least, Ehud Barak, again, a former prime minister, who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying the Bush administration should first of all focus on Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. This is the quintessential failure of US foreign policy.
Absolutely.
So far this century.
Yeah, it's black and white.
And it's being cheerled to the rafters by those politicians, also AIPAC. And then this is really extraordinary. You've got this from Gary Rosenblatt, editor of the Jewish Week. Washington's imminent war on Saddam Hussein is an opportunity to rid the war of a dangerous tyrant who presents a particularly horrific threat to Israel. He went on to say, the Torah instructs that when your enemy seeks to kill you, kill him first.
Yeah.
And then you think, this is almost play for play, the exact same thing we're now seeing in Gaza and the West Bank, particularly Gaza right now. The play for play, from the politicians to the columnists. And yet the American political class seems to be falling for it all over again.
Yep. Yeah, because a longevity of a lobby ensures that it's almost part of the DNA of the politician not to question these things and by inertia repeat the same arguments, whether they are relevant to the reality or whether they are fanatic or messianic, doesn't matter.
But aren't there politicians who say, hold on, these are the guys, people around Biden, for instance, who would say, look, these are the guys who said Iraq was a smart idea 20 years ago.
There are some of them. You know, one of them just retired from the minister, from his cabinet. I think some of them are seeing this, but certain generation, the Biden generation, it's part of their DNA. I mean, Bernie Sanders is an exception, doesn't prove the rule in the Democratic Party. But it's the younger. We have to look at these younger Democrats and see how far they will go. I think they would find it very difficult to repeat these kinds of slogans or justifications.
We've talked about Christian Zionists a few times. What's their role been in promoting effectively a permanent war on West Asia in the last 20 years? Because something we've not really covered in this interview so far is the hypothesis that Israel wants the United States in West Asia permanently. It's constantly looking to start wars in the region, presently with Iran, so that America is stuck there, which actually serves Israeli interests, whereas really America wants to go to the Pacific, deal with China, to a lesser extent deal with Russia. So you've got the foreign policy interests, actually, the US is saying, we don't really want to be in West Asia. But then you have the ideology of the Christian Zionists saying, no, we absolutely want to be here. How has their power sort of ebbed and flowed over the last 20 years? Clearly, it's at a high point with George W. Bush. But they must be doing something right, because the US has never been more active in that part of the world.
Yeah, but it's not only Christian Zionism, it's also petrol and oil. Don't underestimate the importance of oil here and gas and fossil energy. America is definitely not leading the world towards diversification and alternative energy sources. So it's still a very important resource for American economy and energy market. So it would be interesting if petrol and gas was not there, whether these thinly kind of theological justification would have been upheld. I don't think so. I think it's a combination of this theology in a country. We know America is a country with a large number of very religious people who can easily be galvanized into ideas like that. That is true. But it's also the mecca of capitalism. And it needs to go together. It needs to go together. And the natural resources in the Middle East on the one hand, and it's the role of Christian Zionism on the other, and are the reason that Israel can persuade America to be in West Asia. So I wouldn't say that it was just the Israeli success. There are other interests there. We cannot deny the fact that certain ideologies of the regimes in the area are playing into the role of the Americans. I mean, like the Iranian regime. We also know why these political Islamic movements have arisen, because America did not allow the secular left, to be a power to reckon with in that area. So you got the political Islamic movements. And so it's a bit more complex than that, but definitely, and I think that is the most important bottom line. If you take Israel out of the equation of American politics in West Asia, America would be either very isolationist, and by that stop doing harm there, or would be progressive and stop doing harm. Israel does not allow it to go either way fully, but it might happen. I'm not taking a teleological determinist view of American policy. I think it can change.
I presume you've heard of somebody called Luke Akehurst.
Yes.
Who hasn't? He's all over social media. He's now a prospective parliamentary candidate. He'll probably be an MP. He was, I think, without doubt, the most powerful figure on the Labour Party NEC. Still is. And he was also a lobbyist. I presume he doesn't do that for now, for We Believe in Israel, which is connected to BICOM and is, again, part of this big pro-Israel lobby apparatus. Is there a precedent in British politics? You know, you've talked about 150 years of this stuff. Is there a precedent in British politics of somebody so deeply ensconced within the lobby, not being lobbied, part of the lobby, also being such a senior figure within the Labour Party?
Yeah, I mean, in other parties, I can think about Herbert Samuel as being someone like this, but it was the Liberal Party, not the Labour Party. I'm not sure that Harold Wilson should be exempted from our historical assessment as someone who was both a lobbyist and the Prime Minister of Britain, and never saw any contradiction in those two capacities. So I think, yeah, probably you have it in him. Other than that, no, I don't think so. I mean, I know Tony Blair. I write about it. Tony Blair owed a lot to the Israeli lobby for his success in the fight for the candidacy in the Labour Party, not for the Prime Minister, not for the national elections. He won them without the Israeli lobby. I don't want to rewrite history here, but definitely to be elevated to be a candidate, he needed the Israeli lobby. But he didn't act as a lobbyist for Israel. I mean, he had his own problems, so to speak. So yeah, that's quite unique. That's quite unique.
Well, you say Wilson, who of course very pro-Israel, but I'm trying to think of somebody whose job was to be a lobbyist for a foreign country. And you said Herbert Samuel. It's the exact. I mean, it's the exact same thing. Although of course he was Jewish.
Yeah.
And that makes the Akers story all the stranger. But this idea of somebody going from whether it's Paul Zion or LFI or whatever, these organizations have lasted for so long, senior members of staff whose job is to represent the interests of Israel, becoming effectively some of the most powerful people in the Labour Party.
Britain, yeah.
Or is there similar in the Conservative Party, looking at your long archive of these people?
No, probably no, not to that extent. Not to that extent, yeah. It was always a bit more vague.
Yeah.
The kind of parallelism between your job in the lobby and your job in the government. Yeah, probably. And the only thing I can think of was that somewhere at the beginning of Zionism, Britain was the British propaganda ministry in the First World War was using, had a special department to convince Jews to support Zionism.
Wow.
Which is part of the British Ministry of Propaganda. They had a special section that its role was to convince Jews, because it was a minority idea, that Zionism is a good idea. Yeah, but no, that's probably so straightforward, so explicit. I would think it's quite a unique case.
I mean, when you're in lobbying, you're not meant to be the story, right?
Yeah.
You said Blair a moment ago couldn't have, or would have. It would have been harder for him to become the leader of the Labour Party without the Israel lobby. What do you mean by that?
As I say in the book, it was an issue of funding to get the nomination in the internal elections, and he was helped by certain rich pro-Zionist Jews to get a special fund, that because he had a complicated relationship with the TUC, that usually the TUC is the one that gives you the resources if you are fighting, for the nomination. Yes, it is a democratic process. Eventually, the party members, but as we know, this is the modern world. You need also a PR. So that part of it was very much connected to the pro-Israeli lobby. And I think that they would say that it was worth it, namely that Tony Blair's policies were definitely pro-Israeli.
I mean, that might sound like a conspiracy theory to some
No,
people.
but that's what I mean, that he didn't sign a document that said, because of that, he would have been maybe pro-Israeli anyway, giving his, he became kind of a newborn Christian through the process of being a prime minister. So it might have happened anyway. But I'm just saying that it's interesting that the lobby identified correctly who should be the next prime minister, if you want.
So he joins Labour Friends of Israel as soon as becoming an MP in 1983.
That's right.
So that's, like you say, he could have done that anyway. But what's really fascinating is that he's introduced to a man called Michael Levy.
Michael Levy, exactly.
Who is this superstar fundraiser for New Labour over the years that follow. He raises £15 million for New Labour. That's a lot of money today. It was a hell of a lot more money 30 years ago.
Oh my God, yes.
So how is he introduced to Michael Levy? Because, of course, this is before he becomes leader of the Labour Party.
Well, that's it's interesting. It's in a dinner in the Israeli ambassador's house. So you can see the connection, the embassy, Labour Friends of Israel, a promising candidate for a prime minister. I think it speaks for itself. I call it the little dinner, based on Hardy's famous tale of such a dinner, and in the same house where the Israeli embassy is today. That's why I thought it was quite curious. Yeah, definitely. It is the introduction of Tony Blair to the power of the lobby both in terms of how influential it is in Israel itself and how rich it is in British politics in terms of resources and so on.
And some of the names, they've re-emerged in recent years. I mean, one is Trevor Chin, who was a very large funder towards Keir Starmer and his campaign. I mean, there's real parallels. But this is really remarkable. Just to repeat what you've just said here. The superstar fundraiser for New Labour meets Tony Blair before he's even the Labour Party leader in the home or the residence of the Israeli ambassador.
Absolutely.
And they're introduced there. Levy then goes to work for Blair, and he provides the financial wherewithal for Blair to become the Labour leader.
And they send Blair to visit Israel, probably at the expense of Levy.
That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. It's we have to differentiate between how Blair probably saw it,
of course,
and how the Israelis saw it. The Israelis saw it as a bonanza. They have really influenced this. It's possible that Blair said, it's one of the many issues that would be on the table. I'm okay with this. We have to be careful here. We mentioned that Blair's 365 days a year dealt with Israel and thought about Israel. He had other fish to fry, so to speak. But I'm interested in the lobby. I mean, the lobby says we're so powerful, we can define the nature. We will decide who's the next prime minister of Britain, or we will influence the next prime minister of Israel. And we look at the policies. I mean, the dividends are there, although, as I say in the book, I'm very clear about this book. Blair or Thatcher or Wilson did not deviate from British policy towards Israel since 1948, probably. So it's not that they brought... What the lobby succeeded in doing, and people should understand it, is that Britain should not change its attitude towards Israel. Now, why is this important? Because so much was happening on the ground that so many people in Britain became aware of that started to question this unconditional support for Israel. And that became much more difficult to justify the continuation of the same policy. So Blair does not initiate a new policy towards Israel. He continues the policy despite of what's going on the ground. And I think that's a success of the lobby, but that's also the seeds of its future failure. Because Gaza has shown us that if you thought that 2000 was a bad year, think again. So it's getting worse all the time. It's not getting better. And when it gets worse, this continued unconditional support to Israel is far more difficult to sustain. Far more difficult to sustain. And whoever will be the next prime minister of Britain, whichever party, would have it very difficult to justify as the Israelis are now actively involved in trying to finish what they started in 1948, getting rid of the Palestinians. And in this age with smartphones and, platforms and TV and so on, you cannot hide it. And you have to justify it.
You'll often hear the claim, well, look, every country has a lobby. Every country has interest representation, although you're right to say that Israel is unique in so much that this lobby is there to defend its very existence. And they would say, yes, we do, because we're treated very uniquely. But I can't think of many countries whose national lobby has a story like that with Michael Levy and Tony Blair, £15 million of funds raised for New Labour. I think that's really, really, really extraordinary. Now, there's a part two here, which is, of course, with Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
And we've seen millions of pounds go towards both his campaign and the Labour Party now, more recently. There's the auto glass magnate.
Yeah.
I think his name's Gary Lubner.
Gary Lubner, yeah.
Trevor Chin is back. And what I find super interesting, and maybe you have some insights on this, is you have Labour Together, who raise huge amounts of money, which is this organisation / think tank. They fail to declare it properly. And they say, well, the reason we didn't declare it is because some of the people involved are Jewish and we don't want to generate an anti-Semitic response.
Yeah.
And it just all looks very strange. It looks all very strange.
And it defeats the purpose because it's so mysterious. It it increases anti-Semitism. It increases the horrible things that people were saying about Jewish money and Jewish financial connections. So instead of fighting the horrific and unfounded allegations about Judaism and finance and money, they are, fueling the anti-Semitic idea because of the way that they are refusing to acknowledge the fact that nowadays, in order to support Israel, you have to probably bribe people, whereas in the past, you probably could have convinced them morally that what they're doing is right.
Things are so bad now.
They're so bad, you need money, influence, intimidation, whatever. Yeah.
The intimidation thing is interesting because you've clearly seen a turn over the last 10 years in Western politics. Maybe longer. You'd say maybe it starts with Obama, Ed Miliband, and then with Corbyn, with Bernie Sanders, it's getting really, really bad now. I think it's beginning to undermine actually some pretty cool democratic features of politics in both countries. But that's an interesting take. I hadn't thought of this idea that actually the Israel lobby is moving towards intimidation because the old moral power no longer works.
If you can't convince them, force them to accept you. Yeah. I try to say to many people who are afraid of this, I said, no, this is a failure of the lobby. If they need to destroy Corbyn, it means that they don't have any moral way of doing it. So, yes, they succeed with Corbyn, but will they succeed with a younger politician? Who would learn from that case? Will it work again? I'm not sure. I'm not totally sure about that.
Final question. You've been kind enough to give us your time today talking to a media outlet, Novara Media. How does the lobby target media outlets in the UK and the US? I mean, again, reading the book, some of the most storied names in British politics and political journalism, Jonathan Dimbleby, Jeremy Bone, have been at the receiving end of the lobby's fury. So how does this work and what are they trying to achieve?
They try to control the narrative. And they really believe that weaponizing anti-Semitism would even convince or deter a very well-known journalist for using a certain language, for exposing certain crimes that Israel commits. And somehow in the mainstream media, there is a certain hierarchy that begins with the editor-in-chief and so on, which has a lot to do with the financial resources of the newspaper and so on, that probably in many cases they are right about it, that they understand well the structure. And the journalist is not the most important person in the neo-capitalist media infrastructure we have in Britain. The journalists are not the one who make the decisions. And therefore they feel powerful. The big question for them now is there is such a crisis of confidence in mainstream media, and people are moving to alternative media, and they believe the alternative media much more than they believe now the mainstream media, with all the dangers that alternative media can have some cranky people as well, that's true. But the people are sort of assertive enough to say, we will find out. And they have no idea how to deal with it. And now that's probably should be the next chapter, if I had time to write it. They are now using AI, artificial intelligence, thousands of students who are willing to be pro-Israeli in order to try and stop the flood, if you want, unsuccessfully, totally unsuccessfully. There's a big scandal in Israel today. It turned out that the Prime Minister office paid, not the Prime Minister office, I'm sorry, the ministry that is responsible for relationship with Jewish communities in the world has paid a company to create, through AI, artificial accounts that defame the people who criticize Israel and increase Israel's popularity. Even the current Israeli press thought it was too much, that it was too much. They claim that they closed it because of the internal, they don't care about the external criticism, but the internal criticism caused them to close it. But I think they will renew it because, and what was so interesting is the explanation. They say we cannot win the moral argument, so we need to use all the methods that are at our disposal. to defend Israel.
Is this stuff a threat to democracy and democratic values? You know, we see it with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. You know, if you don't accept it as a university now, you're anti-Semitic, even though nobody'd heard of it until 5 years ago.
Exactly.
It feels to me, and I wonder where that stops. So clearly, pro-Israel voices, the Israel lobby, is engaged in what would be called an information war against people they disagree with. I do wonder where that stops. Does it just stop with soft power and culture, or would they actually try and intervene in political processes, a bit like was accused against Russia with 2016? Yeah. I think that's overblown, but you do wonder where the red line is with all of this.
Well, I think there's no red line to the effort. The question is, will it be effective? And I doubt it. So I don't know exactly when they would find out that there is a limit to their power. But they still believe that there isn't a limit to what they can do. So it stops when they're crossing a red line that you and I cannot imagine. We don't know what it will be. But we can predict quite safely that there will be such a red line because they have no inhibition in the way that they're working.
Ilan Pappé, I have learned so much.
Thank you.
In this hour, and the book is phenomenal. Real pleasure speaking to you because, like I say, your work over recent decades is invaluable. And I think, it's going to have real consequences politically, I hope, for a very long time. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.